It's February 1983, North London. A plumber kneels beside a manhole, unscrewing a rusted cover. What he finds in the drain below will expose a quiet, polite civil servant as one of Britain's most prolific serial killers. The man who opens his front door to police that night is calm, almost relieved. His name? Dennis Andrew Nilsen. Over the coming days, detectives will unravel a story that stretches back nearly a decade, a story rooted in loneliness, control, and the dark psychology of possession. This is the Morgue Report. Tonight, we trace Dennis Nilsen's path from a lonely boy in coastal Scotland to the unassuming man whose home became the centre of a national investigation. This story is not about gore, it's about what happens when human connection curdles into obsession. Fraserburgh, in Aberdeenshire, Scotland, is a tight-knit fishing town where the North Sea shapes every life. Dennis Nilsen was born in 1945, the middle child of a struggling marriage. His father, Olav Magnus Moxheim, was a Norwegian soldier who was rarely home. His mother, Elizabeth Duthie White, was young and overwhelmed. The pair met when Olav travelled to Scotland in 1940 as part of the Free Norwegian Forces. Olav adopted the name Nilsen and married White in 1942. The union between Nilsen's parents was fractured from the start. His father, more devoted to his role with the Free Norwegian Forces than to family life, treated marriage as an afterthought, rarely present and offering little stability. By the time her third child arrived, Nilsen's mother admitted that she had rushed into marriage without thinking. The relationship collapsed soon after. Their divorce was finalised in 1948. All three children, Olav Jr., Dennis and Sylvia, were conceived during their father's fleeting returns home, brief reminders of a marriage that never truly existed. After the separation, Nilsen's maternal grandparents, Andrew and Lily White, who had long disapproved of their daughter's choice of husband, stepped in to support her and the children, offering the security their father never had. Nilsen's first real bond was with his grandfather, a fisherman who treated him with quiet affection. When the old man died suddenly in 1951, 6-year-old Dennis was brought to see the body. He would later recall it as the first moment death felt peaceful, a stillness he never forgot. In the years after his grandfather's death, something in Dennis Nilsen shifted. He grew silent, distant. Hours would pass with him standing alone by the harbour, watching the herring boats drift in and out, as if searching for something among the waves. At home, he withdrew further. Family gatherings became background noise. Affection from adults was met with detachment. He began to harbour resentment towards the attention lavished on his siblings, his mother, grandmother, and later his stepfather, all seeming to favour Olav Jr. and Sylvia. Nilsen envied his brother's easy charm and the warmth that followed him. Sylvia, however, remained an exception. After their grandfather's passing, she became the only person he truly connected with, the last remaining link to a world that still felt human. Nilsen was to experience death in another form before reaching adulthood. One afternoon, while playing near the harbour with his older brother Olav, Nilsen was pushed, or perhaps fell, into the cold North Sea. He couldn't swim, and the water swallowed him whole. A fisherman spotted the struggling boy and hauled him back to shore, lifeless and blue. But death, it seemed, wasn't ready for him yet. Nilsen was revived. He opened his eyes, silent, dazed, changed. Later in life, he would speak of that moment with unsettling calm. He said he remembered watching his body from above, weightless, peaceful, detached. It was his first encounter with death, and he found comfort in it. From that day on, water became a symbol, cleansing, quiet, and deadly. It lingered in his thoughts, and years later it would return in the most disturbing of ways. flowing through the drains of his own flat on Melrose Avenue. As Nilsen moved into adolescence, the small town of Stricken began to feel like a cage, a place with little to offer beyond routine and repetition. Entertainment was scarce, ambition even scarcer. He admired his mother and stepfather for keeping the family afloat, but underneath that respect grew resentment. They had settled for less, he thought. Their world was one of modest means and muted dreams, a world he wanted to escape. The Nilsen home, worn and unremarkable, became something he was ashamed to show. Friends were rarely invited. At 14, Dennis found his way out, or at least the idea of one. He joined the Army Cadet Force, drawn to the order, the structure, the promise of a life beyond the quiet streets of Stricken. The British Army became more than a career path in his mind. It was a lifeline, a way to leave behind the place where he felt invisible. At 16, Dennis Nilsen traded the grey skies of Stricken for the olive drab of the British Army. He enlisted as a cook with the Army Catering Corps, a choice that would later prove disturbingly significant. The discipline, the structure, the hierarchy, all of it gave him purpose. For the first time, he belonged somewhere. He trained at Stirling Castle, where the recruits were taught precision and routine, the rhythm of military life. Nilsen excelled. He was methodical, reliable, and unflinchingly calm under pressure. Those traits earned him respect from his peers, but they also hid something deeper, a growing sense of detachment. During his service, Nilsen was posted to West Germany, Cyprus, and the Middle East. He learned to butcher meat, to cook for hundreds, to handle knives with skill and efficiency. He spoke often of how the military stripped away sentimentality. Men came and went, and feelings had no place in uniform. Yet beneath that hardened exterior, there were cracks. Nilsen's diaries later revealed that he had developed confusing and secretive thoughts about his attraction to fellow soldiers. He described moments of intense fascination with sleeping comrades, the stillness of their bodies, the quiet vulnerability of rest. He would sometimes drink heavily before lying beside them, feigning sleep, his feelings buried beneath layers of shame and fear. He kept his desires hidden behind a soldier's mask, channeling his focus into duty. By the late 1960s, he had reached the rank of corporal, serving as a skilled cook and instructor. But the uniform, the rank, the routine, none of it quietened what was growing inside of him. In one incident he later recalled, Nilsen witnessed the aftermath of a violent shooting during his time in the Middle East. The sight of the body, lifeless, pale, and oddly serene, disturbed him less than it should have. Instead, he felt the same eerie calm he'd known since his near drowning as a child. Death didn't horrify him, it fascinated him. After more than a decade of service, Nilsen left the army in 1972. By then, he was a man trained in discipline and concealment, a cook who knew how to carve, how to clean, how to dispose. On the surface, he was polite and composed, but beneath the order and control, something darker had been quietly learning how to breathe. Psychologists would later describe his inner world as one of emotional starvation. Control became his substitute for intimacy. He couldn't rely on others, so he built a life where everything was predictable, contained. His. By the mid-1970s, Nilsen left the army and moved to London. He worked briefly as a police cadet, then a civil servant. He rented a small flat in North London, kept a dog named Bleep, and blended into the crowd. By April 1973, Nilsen had traded one uniform for another. He completed his police training and was stationed at Willesden Green, stepping into a life of law and order. As a young constable, he made several arrests. Nothing dramatic, nothing violent. He preferred procedure over confrontation. Nilsen liked the work, he liked the rules, but the camaraderie of the army was gone. The laughter, the shared hardship, the belonging, replaced by London's quiet hum and the long, empty hours between shifts. He began drinking alone, the pint glass becoming his only company. That summer, Nilsen started visiting gay pubs across London, searching for connection but finding only fleeting encounters. He later recalled them soul-destroying, describing how he would only lend his body in a vain search for inner peace. What he wanted was permanence, something that wouldn't walk away in the morning. By August, a failed relationship pushed him to breaking point. He decided his private life didn't belong inside a police uniform. That same month, his estranged father died in Ghana, leaving him £1,000, a distant gesture from a man he'd never really known. In December 1973, Nilsen resigned from the force. The badge, the structure, the control, all gone. By this time, Dennis Nilsen had mastered the art of appearing ordinary. A quiet man, polite to a fault, clocking in on time and drinking alone when the day was done. To his colleagues, he was efficient. To his superiors, unremarkable. Behind the routine, something far more complex was unfolding. Since childhood, Nilsen had learned to survive through detachment. When his grandfather died, he retreated. When he almost drowned, he remembered not panic, but peace. That calm, floating detachment would become a refuge he'd return to again and again. In stricken, in the army, in the police, every uniform gave him purpose, and every loss took it away. The military had offered structure, the police had offered order, but when both were gone, there was nothing left to fill the silence. It was November 1975 when Dennis Nilsen met David Gallican, a 20-year-old being threatened outside a North London pub. Nilsen stepped in, played the rescuer, and took him back to his small room on Tynemouth Road. They spent the night drinking and talking. Gallican was new to London, unemployed and adrift. Nilsen saw something familiar in him, someone lost, someone who needed keeping. The next morning, they agreed to move in together. Using part of his father's inheritance, Nilsen found them a ground-floor flat at 195 Melrose Avenue in Cricklewood. He even arranged exclusive use of the back garden, a quiet corner of earth that would, in time, hold its own secrets. The flat was bare when they arrived, its walls stripped and tired. They redecorated together, trying to build a home from nothing, but soon the cracks appeared. Nilsen worked, Gallican didn't. The imbalance grew. Nilsen saw himself as the provider, the steady one, but beneath it lay resentment and frustration. He was sexually drawn to Gallican, yet their intimacy faded quickly. Within a year, they were sleeping in separate beds, their affection replaced by arguments and silence. Gallican would later say Nilsen never hit him, but the words cut deep enough. The shouting became routine. By May 1977, the relationship ended. Whether he left or was told to leave, neither could fully agree. After that, Nilsen drifted through a series of brief, shallow relationships. None lasted more than a few weeks. No one stayed. Each goodbye fed the growing belief that he was unfit to be loved. By late 1978, Dennis Nilsen was alone again. The flat quiet, his nights filled with drink and music. He buried himself in work, the only part of his life that still obeyed the rules. As the months passed, the loneliness sharpened into something else, a thought that wouldn't go away. If he couldn't keep someone's love, perhaps he could keep them. Between 1978 and 1983, Dennis Nilsen murdered at least 12 men and boys, and tried to kill at least 7 more. When he was arrested, he calmly told detectives the number was around 16. Most of his victims were young, vulnerable men, often homeless, unemployed, or gay. People who could vanish without much notice. Others were ordinary passers-by, men he met on buses, in pubs, or once just outside his own front door. Every killing took place behind closed doors, inside the 2 North London flats he called home. First on Melrose Avenue, and then later on Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill. His method was deliberate. The invitation was simple: a drink, a meal, a place to stay. The tone was kind, almost fatherly. Once inside, Nilsen's guests would eat, drink, and relax, unaware that they would never leave. He would strangle them, often with a ligature, until life slipped away. Sometimes he stopped short, watching them drift into unconsciousness before finishing the act in water, the bathtub, the sink, or even a bucket. He called it the final piece. After death, ritual began. Nilsen bathed and dressed the bodies, speaking to them, posing them, keeping them near. For days, sometimes for months, the dead remained in his flat, silent company for a man who could not stand to be alone. At his Melrose Avenue address, the remains were later dismembered and burned in the garden. He removed the internal organs before the fires, scattering them behind a fence or near Gladstone Park. At Muswell Hill, where fire wasn't an option, he adapted, flushing flesh and small bones down the toilet, hiding what remained beneath floorboards and within cupboards. Nilsen admitted to masturbating beside several of the bodies, and to performing sexual acts with 6 of them. He insisted, almost coldly, that there was no penetration. To him, it wasn't about sex, it was about possession, stillness, control. It was Christmas 1978 when Dennis Nilsen was drinking alone and met Stephen Holmes, a 14-year-old boy who'd been turned away from a North London pub. Nilsen invited him back to his flat for a drink and some music. Holmes was tired, grateful, and young enough to trust a stranger. By morning, the boy was asleep beside him. Nilsen later said he was afraid to wake him in case he left. That fear, of loss, of abandonment, became the moment that everything changed. He reached for a tie, straddled the sleeping boy, and squeezed until silence. Then, calmly, he drowned him in a bucket of water. He washed his body, dressed him, and spoke to him, as if nothing had happened. He kept Stephen's corpse beneath the floorboards for 8 months before burning it in the garden, describing the ritual with almost clinical detachment. From that night, the line between companionship and possession disappeared. In 1979, Nilsen tried again, this time with Andrew Ho, a student who'd managed to escape and report the attack. Police questioned Nilsen, but without a willing complainant, the matter was dropped. 2 months later, he met Kenneth Ockenden, a 23-year-old Canadian tourist. They shared drinks, music, and an evening that seemed harmless, until Nilsen wrapped the cord of his headphones around Ockenden's neck. When it was over, Nilsen poured himself a drink and continued listening to the same tape, through the same cord that had just killed a man. He photographed the body, sat beside him to watch television, and even spoke to him as if he could still hear. For 2 weeks, Ockenden's remains were his only company. By 1980, Nilsen was killing more often. His third victim, Martin Duffy, was just 16, homeless, hungry, and grateful for a meal. He died as he slept. Nilsen bathed with his body and later described the sight as bittersweetness and temporary peace. William David Sutherland was Nilsen's 4th victim and a 26-year-old father of 1, originally from Edinburgh, who occasionally worked as a male prostitute. Sutherland met Nilsen in a pub near Piccadilly Circus in August 1980. Nilsen later stated he could not recall the exact details of the murder, only that he strangled Sutherland while standing or kneeling in front of him, and that by the following morning there was another dead body. Over the months that followed, the floorboards beneath 195 Melrose Avenue filled with bodies. The stench of decay was constant. Flies gathered. Nilsen sprayed insecticide and burned incense, trying to mask the truth. When the rot became unbearable, he dug up the remains, dissected them, and burned them on a bonfire, sometimes as children from the neighbourhood watched. One skull refused to break, so he smashed it with a rake. Many of these men were unidentified and sadly remain so. Nilsen recalled his fifth victim only as a tall Irish labourer with rough hands, dressed in an old suit, jacket and worn shoes. He estimated the man's height to be between 5'9" and 5'10", and his age between 27 and 30. Nilsen stated that they met at the Cricklewood Arms in late 1980. He later claimed to have fabricated this account. The sixth victim was described by Nilsen as a slender male prostitute of either Filipino or Mexican descent, aged between 20 and 30 and approximately 5'10". Nilsen remarked that the man had gypsy-like features and said that they had met at the Salisbury Arms in October 1980. Victim number 7 was described as an English vagrant in his 20s whom Nilsen found sleeping in a doorway at the top of Charing Cross Road. The man was emaciated, pale, and missing several teeth. After taking a taxi to Melrose Avenue, the man was strangled as he slept, his legs reportedly moving in a cycling motion during the attack. Nilsen later reflected that the victim's life had been one of long suffering, describing the killing as easy as taking candy from a baby. The final victim of 1980, number 8, was described as a long-haired English hippie between 25 and 30, whom Nilsen met in the West End after the pubs had closed in late 1980. His body was initially kept beneath the floorboards, later dismembered into 3 parts, and returned to the same location. The remains were eventually burned a year later. Nilsen subsequently claimed to have fabricated this victim. The 9th victim was described as an 18-year-old Scottish youth with blonde hair and blue eyes, wearing a green tracksuit top and trainers. Nilsen met him at the Golden Lion pub in Soho in early January 1981. After a drinking contest at Melrose Avenue, the man was killed and his body dissected on the 12th of January. Murdered sometime in February 1981, the next victim, the 10th, was remembered only as a slim, dark-haired man from Belfast in his early 20s, around 5'9". Nilsen said that he met him in the West End after closing time, strangled him with a necktie, and concealed the body beneath the floorboards. The 11th victim, according to Nilsen, was a muscular, young English skinhead of about 20, whom he met at a food stall in Leicester Square in April 1981. The man wore a black leather jacket and had a tattoo around his neck reading, "Cut Here." He allegedly boasted about being tough and liking to fight. Nilsen claimed that he hung the victim's torso in his bedroom for 24 hours before hiding the remains under the floorboards. He later admitted that this account too was fabricated. By 1981, the ritual had become mechanical. He spoke of death as routine. End of the day, end of the drink, end of a person. His final victim at Melrose Avenue was Malcolm Barlow, a young man from Sheffield. Malcolm suffered with epilepsy and Nilsen had once helped him to hospital. When Barlow returned to thank him, Nilsen strangled him as he slept on the sofa. Soon after, Nilsen's landlord decided to renovate. Nilsen was paid about £1,000 to leave. On his last day in the flat, he built one final bonfire. 5 bodies, 1 tyre, and a wall of smoke that carried the smell of human flesh over Cricklewood for the last time. He moved into a new flat at 23D Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, a new address, but the same old silence. When Dennis Nilsen had moved into 23D Cranley Gardens, the landscape of death had to change. There was no garden for bonfires, and the attic flat met no floorboards to hide beneath. For 2 months he managed restraint, or something like it. Those he invited home were left unharmed, at least for a while. But this changed in March 1982. In a pub near Leicester Square, Nilsen met John Howlett, a 23-year-old who followed him home for a drink. What began as quiet conversation ended in violence. Howlett fought back hard enough that Nilsen feared he'd lose control. The struggle left marks around his own throat. When the fight was over, Nilsen filled his bathtub and drowned Howlett. the same calm ritual now confined to a smaller, colder space. 2 months later, Karl Stotter, a 21-year-old man reeling from heartbreak, Nilsen found him drinking alone in the Black Cat pub and offered comfort, a place to stay, and reassurance that nothing would happen. Stotter awoke to Nilsen's whisper, "Stay still." He felt hands around his neck, water filling his lungs, and when he came to, he was in an armchair, Nilsen's dog licking his face. Somehow he was still alive. Nilsen nursed him back to consciousness, insisting it had all been a misunderstanding, that Stotter had caught himself in the sleeping bag zipper and that the water was meant to bring him out of shock. He walked him to the station 2 days later and said goodbye. Karl Stotter never went to the police. In October 1982, Nilsen met Graham Allen, a 27-year-old trying to hail a taxi. Allen accepted an invitation for a meal. While he ate an omelette, Nilsen wrapped a cord around his neck. He later said he couldn't remember the exact moment he decided to kill Allen, only that it was inevitable. The body stayed in the bath for 3 days before dissection began. Then came Stephen Sinclair, just 20 years old, Nilsen's final victim. On the 26th of January 1983, the two walked home together. Sinclair, numbed by drink and drugs, fell asleep in an armchair while Nilsen listened to Tommy. Watching him, Nilsen muttered, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again." He strangled him with a tie and rope, discovering later that Sinclair's wrists were already scarred from suicide attempts. He followed his ritual to the letter, bathed the body, powdered it, surrounded the bed with mirrors, and lay naked beside him. Before he slept, he turned Sinclair's face towards him, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "Good night, Stephen." When the body began to decay, he dismembered it, wrapping pieces in plastic and sealing them with the same bandages he'd found on Sinclair's wrists. The smaller parts he boiled or flushed down the toilet. It was a method born of necessity, but it would become the mistake that finally exposed him. By early February 1983, the drains of Cranley Gardens began to clog. The smell rose through the pipes. Nilsen, ever the civil servant, wrote a letter of complaint to his estate agent, demanding someone come and fix the blockage. He had no idea that the drains themselves were about to turn witness. It began with the plumbing complaint. On the 8th of February 1983, a Dino Rod employee named Michael Catron arrived at 23D Cranley Gardens to inspect a blocked drain. The tenants had been complaining for days, including Dennis Nilsen himself. When Catron lifted the drain cover, he froze. The pipe was packed with a pale, waxy substance and small fragments of bone. It looked disturbingly like flesh. Unsure what he'd found, he called his supervisor, Gary Wheeler. With daylight fading, they agreed to return in the morning. Before leaving, Nilsen wandered outside to chat with them. When Catron remarked that the blockage looked a bit like human flesh, Nilsen smirked and said, "Looks to me like someone's been flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken." The next morning the men returned, and the drain was suspiciously clear. Someone had been busy overnight. Tracing the pipe back, Catron found more scraps of flesh and 4 small bones from a human hand. The police were called and samples were sent to Hornsey Mortuary, where a pathologist confirmed the truth. The remains were human, and one piece of tissue showed a clear ligature mark. Detective Chief Inspector Peter J. led the investigation. After speaking to the tenants, officers learned of the top floor flat, the source of the drain, belonged to Dennis Nilsen. They waited outside for him to return from work. When he did, they approached calmly. Jay introduced himself and explained they were investigating the drains. Nilsen seemed unfazed, even polite. "Why the police?" he asked. "Are those men health inspectors?" Inside his flat, the officers were hit by the unmistakable smell of decomposition. Jay told Nilsen that the blockage had been caused by human remains. Feigning shock, Nilsen said quietly, "Good grief, how awful." Jay didn't play along. "Don't mess about. Where's the rest of the body?" he said. Nilsen hesitated, then answered flatly, "In 2 plastic bags, in the wardrobe." The officers could smell the rot from where they stood. They didn't open the cupboard. When asked if there was more, Nilsen sighed. "It's a long story," he said. "It goes back a long time. I'll tell you everything, just not here." He was arrested on suspicion of murder. During the drive to Hornsey police station, an officer asked how many victims there were. Nilsen stared out the window and said, 15 or 16, since 1978. That night, police searched the flat. Inside the wardrobe were 2 plastic bags, one containing 2 torsos, one of them sliced in half, the other holding a skull, a severed head, a partial torso, and internal organs packed into a shopping bag. Both heads, investigators noticed, had been subjected to moist heat, boiled perhaps, in an attempt to strip away what was left of humanity. The drains had done what his victims could not. They had spoken. 2 days after his arrest, on the 10th of February 1983, Dennis Nilsen began to talk. He told detectives that more remains could be found inside his flat, some packed into a tea chest in the living room, others hidden in an upturned drawer in the bathroom. They were the dismembered bodies of 3 men, all strangled, usually with a tie. One he couldn't name, another he called John the Guardsman. The third was Stephen Sinclair. Calmly, almost conversationally, Nilsen admitted that his killing had begun in December 1978 at 195 Melrose Avenue, where he claimed to have murdered 12 or 13 men, and to have tried and failed to kill several others. That same day, police searched the flat again. They found legs and a lower torso in a bag in the bathroom, and a skull, more bones, and part of a torso in the tea chest. Nilsen then accompanied officers back to Melrose Avenue, pointing out the exact spots where he had built his bonfires, the pyres that had erased what was left of the dead. By the evening, word had leaked. The dyno rod engineer, still shaken by what he'd found, contacted the Daily Mirror. The next morning, the headline hit the front page, and Britain learned the name Dennis Nilsen for the first time. The police had 48 hours to charge Nilsen or let him go. At Hornsey Mortuary, Professor David Bowen examined the remains. Fingerprints taken from one body matched those of Stephen Sinclair, and at 5:40 p.m. on the 11th of February, Dennis Nilsen was charged with murder. Over the next several days, he spoke for more than 30 hours of interviews. He wasn't defiant, and he wasn't proud. He was curious. When asked why, he said, "I'm hoping you'd tell me that." He described strangling most victims and, when necessary, drowning them once unconscious. Afterward, he bathed, shaved, and dressed the bodies, applying makeup to smooth imperfections, keeping them close as if they were still alive. He talked to them, sat them in chairs, arranged them beside him in bed. He said their stillness brought him peace, that they were too perfect and too beautiful for the pathetic ritual of sex. Every personal belonging was destroyed, every name erased. The men were no longer people to him, but props in a fantasy he called the art of death. At Melrose Avenue, he had stored several bodies beneath the floorboards, bringing them out to lie beside him or watch television together. When decay began, he'd pour whiskey, grab salt to brush away maggots, and begin dissection. The remains went into plastic bags, dumped behind fences or burned on bonfires crowned with the old tyres to mask the smell of human flesh. When asked about the boiled heads found at Cranley Gardens, Nilsen explained that he'd used a large cooking pot, boiling the skulls to dissolve tissue to make disposal easier. The rest was flushed away. He claimed no pleasure in the killings, only a compulsion. I wished I could stop, he said, but I couldn't. I had no other thrill or happiness. And then, almost with reverence, I didn't enjoy killing. I worshipped the art and the act of death. On the 11th of February 1983, Dennis Nilsen was formally charged with the murder of Stephen Sinclair, and he was transferred to HMP Brixton, where he would await trial. The man who had confessed to killing 15, now reduced to a prisoner number behind a locked door. Nilsen described his mood as one of resignation and relief. The secrecy was over. The burden of concealment lifted. He believed, perhaps naively, that the law would still treat him as innocent until proven guilty. He refused to wear a prison uniform, insisting that it violated his rights as a remand prisoner. When guards tried to enforce it, he threatened to strip naked in protest. The threat was enough, and they confined him to his cell. By August, the defiance had turned physical. He hurled the contents of his chamber pot through the bars, striking several officers. For that, he was convicted of assault and spent 56 days in solitary confinement. Alone again, the one place he'd always seemed most at home. On the 26th of May, Nilsen was formally committed to stand trial at the Old Bailey, charged with 5 murders and 2 attempted murders. A 6th murder charge would soon follow. His legal representation was as unstable as his mood. He hired, fired, and rehired his solicitor, Ronald Moss, in a cycle of control and contradiction. Nilsen wanted to dictate his defence to his own narrative, even from inside a cell. At first, he intended to plead guilty to every charge. Moss prepared accordingly. Then 5 weeks before trial, Nilsen dismissed him again and appointed Ralph Hyams, a barrister known for cases involving complex psychology. On Hyams' advice, Nilsen changed his plea to not guilty by reason of diminished responsibility. Even behind bars, he remained meticulous, measured, and utterly certain of one thing: that his story, and only his, would be the one the world remembered. On the 24th of October 1983, Dennis Nilsen stood trial at the Old Bailey, charged with 6 counts of murder and 2 of attempted murder. He entered the courtroom calm and composed, pleading not guilty to every charge. The facts weren't in dispute. Nilsen had killed. What the court had to decide was why. The prosecution, led by Alan Green QC, argued that Nilsen was sane, calculated, and entirely aware of what he was doing. A man who murdered with planning and control. The defence, under Ivan Lawrence QC, countered that he was suffering from diminished responsibility. A man consumed by loneliness and mental disorder, incapable of forming true intent. The prosecution opened with the story that had horrified Britain: the clogged drains, the plastic bags, the confessions, and the charred remains at Melrose Avenue. They quoted Nilsen himself. At the precise moment of the act, I believe I am right in doing the act. Green's reply was cold and direct. Even if he was abnormal, it wasn't enough to excuse the killing. Witness after witness took the stand. Douglas Stewart described waking in Nilsen's flat in 1980, tied to a chair, and Nilsen strangling him with a tie. Stewart managed to break free as Nilsen shouted, "Take my money!" A calculated act, the prosecution said, to make it sound like a robbery if anyone heard. Then came Paul Nobbs, a student who survived an attack in 1981. He woke with bloodshot eyes, his face swollen and raw. Nilsen, feigning concern, told him, "You look bloody awful, you should see a doctor." Finally, Carl Stotter, the man who Nilsen had strangled, drowned, revived, and sent home alive, told his story through tears. He recalled Nilsen whispering, "Stay still," as he pushed him under the water. He remembered the dog licking his face as he came back to life. The courtroom fell silent. Detectives Peter J. and Chambers read from Nilsen's own words, the calm, methodical confessions he had given after his arrest. "I have no tears for my victims," he had said. "I have no tears for myself." Even as jurors heard about the boiling, the dismemberment, the rot, and the maggots, Nilsen listened impassively, arms folded, expression blank. The defence turned to psychiatry. Dr. James McKee told the court that Nilsen was emotionally stunted, a man who could only express anger, who found beauty in stillness, and who had never developed the capacity for empathy. He called it an unspecified personality disorder, one severe enough to reduce his responsibility. Dr. Patrick Galloway went further, describing a borderline pseudo-normal narcissistic personality that fractured under isolation. During those breakdowns, Galloway said Nilsen became impulsive, detached, and driven by compulsion, not malice. But the prosecution had its own expert. Dr. Paul Bowden, who had interviewed Nilsen 16 times, told the jury the truth was simpler. Nilsen was not insane. He was manipulative, intelligent, and entirely in control. A man who objectified others because it suited him. There was no disorder of the mind, only the choice to kill. On the 3rd of November 1983, the jury retired. The next day they returned their verdict. Guilty on 6 counts of murder and 1 of attempted murder, with a unanimous guilty verdict for the attack on Paul Nobbs. Mr. Justice Croom Johnson sentenced him to life imprisonment, recommending a minimum of 25 years behind bars. Dennis Nilsen showed no emotion as the words were read. For the first time in years, someone else had taken control of his life, and this time he couldn't bring it back. After his conviction, Dennis Nilsen was sent to HMP Wormwood Scrubs to begin his life sentence. Classified as a Category A prisoner, he was kept under the highest security but allowed to mix with others. He filed no appeal. The verdict, he said, was correct. He admitted he had been in full control and that he had killed with purpose. On the day of his conviction, he told officers he took his greatest thrill not in the killing itself, but in the social seduction, the getting the friend back, the decision to kill, the body, and its disposal. The same calm detachment followed him into prison life. He claimed that alcohol, not morality, had saved at least 2 of his intended victims. In December 1983, another inmate, Albert Moffat, slashed Nilsen's face and chest with a razor blade. 89 stitches were needed to close the wounds. Nilsen survived, as he always had, quietly and without emotion. He was moved briefly to HMP Parkhurst and then on to HMP Wakefield, where he remained for 7 years. In 1991, concern for his safety led to his transfer to the Vulnerable Prisoner Unit at HMP Full Sutton. 2 years later, he was moved again, this time to HMP Whitemoor, still under Category A status and kept increasingly apart from others. In September 1992, nearly a decade after his arrest, Dennis Nilsen agreed to an interview with Central Television for a documentary on offender profiling called Viewpoint 1993 Murder in Mind. He spoke calmly and clinically about what he'd done. When the Home Office tried to block the broadcast, citing copyright ownership and lack of consent, Central Television fought back, taking the government to court. On the 26th of January 1993, the ruling went in the favour of Central Television. That night, Nilsen's interview was broadcast in full. 4 minutes of chilling self-reflection from a man who had murdered for companionship. In 1994, Home Secretary Michael Howard replaced Dennis Nilsen's 25-year minimum term with a whole life tariff, a decision that meant Nilsen would never leave prison. He accepted it without protest. From then on, his world became smaller. He translated books into Braille, read constantly, and composed music on a small keyboard. He painted, wrote letters, and corresponded with strangers who wanted to hear from the killer who called himself a man who couldn't stop. Behind bars, Nilsen spent years writing letters and filing legal complaints, challenging everything from prison procedure to censorship. He even took the prison service to court in 2001, claiming that his human rights were breached after explicit content was removed from the gay magazines he subscribed to. The case was dismissed. By then, Nilsen had already written more than 400 pages of an autobiography, a manuscript that he titled The History of a Drowning Boy. The name was no coincidence. It harked back to his near death as a child and the calm he described feeling beneath the water. In those pages, he admitted he had always lived two lives, the real and the fantasy. When I was with people, I was in the real world, he wrote. In private, I snapped instantly into fantasy. I could move between them with ease. He blamed his emotional emptiness, alcohol, and opportunity for each killing, and described them as moments of temporary relief from a lifetime of inadequacy. In 2006, his final victim was finally identified as 14-year-old Stephen Holmes. The discovery came too late for prosecution, though Nilsen confirmed the identification himself. Several other victims, at least 4, remain unnamed to this day. Before his own death in 2018, Nilsen corresponded with a man named Mark Austin, exchanging more than 800 letters. Austin later edited Nilsen's autobiography for publication. On the 10th of May 2018, Nilsen was taken from HMP Full Sutton to York Hospital after complaining of intense stomach pain. Doctors discovered a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm, a tear deep within the body's main artery. The damage was repaired, but complications followed. A blood clot formed soon after surgery. 2 days later, on the 12th of May 2018, Dennis Nilsen was dead. The post-mortem listed the causes as pulmonary embolism and retroperitoneal hemorrhage, death by internal collapse. A month later, in June 2018, his body was cremated. 5 people attended, 3 prison officers, 1 official witness, and the man who had exchanged hundreds of letters with him. No family came. The Ministry of Justice covered the £3,323 cost of the service. His ashes were eventually returned to his family, the same family whose name he tried so hard to erase from his story. In the end, Dennis Nilsen's life ended as it had been lived, in isolation, observed only by strangers, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint echo of the horrors he once confessed. Items from his crimes are now preserved in Scotland Yard's Crime Museum. The stove where he boiled human heads, the knives he used for dissection, the headphones that strangled Kenneth Ockerden, and the bathtub where 2 men met their deaths. On the 21st of January 2021, The History of a Drowning Boy was released to the public, the final word of a man who spent 40 years explaining the inexplicable. You've been listening to the Morgue Report. Our next case takes us far from the drains of North London to the highways of America, where the calm of a small-town life concealed a storm, a woman on the edge, a trail of bodies, and a story the world wasn't ready to hear.